Hi class, for this lecture we are going to go over three things: perception, attention, and consciousness. We've already spent a great deal in this course talking about perception, right? That's in the title of the course. And we've been talking about this process in the mind where sensory information gets processed on a very basic level into information that the brain can use to make judgments about the environment. However, what we haven't talked about in depth are the concepts of attention and consciousness. Mostly the idea of attention is discussed in other courses like learning theory for undergraduates. And for graduate students, there can, of course, be advanced courses in things like cognitive psychology, which is where I studied attention on a more theoretical level. Sounds kind of boring, and I'm not going to lie, it sometimes was, but it was also interesting in other ways because it also helps us to understand how attention comes up in other practical discussions, like when giving psychological tests to patients where we're measuring their attention span. Also in cases where we're studying neuropsychology, where people's attention span has been damaged in some way. Also, I think consciousness is the hardest thing to discuss because there are so many different theories and definitions as to just what consciousness is. So what we're going to focus on in this lecture is just a very sort of elementary understanding of it and the relationship between perception, attention, and consciousness. Although some of these topics are a little bit beyond this course, they are important concepts for psychology majors to understand. It helps to build bridges between these different concepts as early as possible because, trust me, you will need to understand these conceptual relationships to get a broader and better, deeper understanding of psychology in general. So let's do a little exercise here. The question I'm going to pose to you right now is, are you conscious right now? Most people are naturally going to say, yes, of course I am. But my question for you at this point is a little bit more in depth. How do you know that you're conscious? How exactly do you know this? What makes you think that you are conscious? At this point, take a pause in the video and humor me by writing down a couple of thoughts and trying to answer these two questions before moving on. When I try to answer these questions, I might say something like this. Well, I know that I'm being asked a question and what that question is. I know where I am at my home office and that it is early in the morning. I can see my dog sleeping on his rug by my desk, and I can feel my fingers hitting the keys on my laptop. I can taste my energy drink while I'm working. I'm able to shift my attention to these things more or less at will whenever I need to. So, what do I learn from these answers? First, when we talk about our conscious experiences, we almost always start out by defining our personal or our perceptual experiences because they are such basic elemental things and are easy to describe. And second, we have to be able to at least pay attention to these things for a brief moment at least in order to describe them. But attention is not always required to have consciousness. For example, if someone is really good at meditating, they can empty their mind and not be really focused on anything much at all, or maybe even not anything at all, and still be conscious. But ordinarily that is really tough to do. I sort of answered this question already to some degree, but let's ask it anyway. Can perception be defined or measured without attention or consciousness? What is perception? Well, this takes us back to the question on a very basic level. Perception is the recognition and interpretation of sensory information. And I'll give you a couple really simple examples here. First, let's consider what happens when you encounter a red light while you're driving. For many people who have been driving a while, they see the red light and stop the car, or at least begin stopping the car without really thinking very much about it or paying more than very limited cursory attention to it. And they might not even have a memory of doing it. But what actually happened behind the scenes is that your brain interpreted the light, and knew what the proper color was and what the decisional process should be, and engaged in an action that followed. Second, which I think is equally as interesting, I might be drinking a soda or energy drink while working, and my tendency to take sips of my drink while working is so secondary and automatic that I am not really paying attention to what I'm doing or how much I drink, or maybe even how much is left. And then at some point I pick up the can and realize there's none left. I think this is probably something that happens to a lot of people, but when we start to break it down, there are some complex processes happening, like being able to recognize the can, to see that can in your personal space, be able to reach it, pick it up, bring it to your face, take a drink. But in spite of all these fairly complex perceptual processes, doing this stuff almost entirely in the background while your focus is somewhere else, you may fail to recognize that you already finished your drink. So the take-home message here is that perception can be measured in behavior without much attention, focus, or awareness, and sometimes none of these things at all. So a follow-up question here is, where the person is doing these things is actually completely conscious? Well, that depends on who you ask. I think this graphic is pretty useful if you are a visual learner. I'm very much a visual learner, and seeing something like this helps add another layer to the understanding that perception, attention, and consciousness might be described as overlapping, simultaneous processes. As you can see here, the blue area is our perception. And as you can also see, there's an area where there is perception, but we are not paying attention to it and are not really conscious that there's something going on there. Then in the area where there's blue and then the yellow area is overlapping it, that's the part where we're perceiving something and we're conscious of it, but maybe not really paying attention to it, sort of like the red light example we talked about before. We're aware of something, but our mind is making decisions and taking actions without us really having to divert our attention to it very much, if at all. Then there is the area of the blue perceptual area where we are also perceiving it and paying attention to it and aware of it all at the same time, like hopefully listening to this lecture. You're seeing it, listening to it, thinking about it, and trying to process it. And finally, the most interesting part of this whole diagram is the part of human consciousness where we aren't really able to control our attention and may not be perceiving anything directly. For example, when we are sleeping and dreaming, our mind is making sense of some type of brain activity, but we're not really in the environment our brain thinks it is. We're in some other level of consciousness, but we're not truly perceiving our environment as it is. And we're not really attending to it. And of course, there are lots of other examples where this sort of thing can happen, like when people have what's called an absence seizure. These are individuals who have a seizure and they're awake, but their brains begin to misfire in ways that prevent it from being able to pay attention and correctly interpret their experience. And so when the seizure is over, these individuals can often have these completely blank spots in their memory and appear somewhat frozen in time for brief periods. It's really fascinating stuff. One of the things we should also focus on is that second level where we are perceiving things and conscious of them, but not really paying attention to it yet because it's such a strange gray area. So question 1 would address the cause and effect relationship of perception and consciousness. As we discussed in previous slides and other lectures, the cause-effect relationships are pretty interesting. Here, I think most of the time we would need to be perceiving something first, and then our conscious mind would need to react to that perceptual information in order to be able to make decisions and react, oftentimes outside of whether we're actually paying attention to it or not. But the parallel here is that we can, of course, be conscious or have at least semi-conscious experiences without perceptual information. Again, think of that dream state we were just talking about a few moments ago. We're experiencing something in a semi-conscious state, but the perceptual information is probably not really happening. If this doesn't absolutely twist your mind, then go back and read the chapters in these slides again, because this is really interesting philosophical stuff. From a theoretical perspective, we can break this stuff down even further. So one theory we can use suggests that we have the ability to engage in some integration of information in order to be to be conscious of it. The mind has adapted to become pretty efficient at being able to take the pieces of information and make sense out of it. So the question then becomes, well, how much information and how much integration is needed for consciousness? Of course, this theory is not really testable from an experimental or empirical standpoint, and this is, of course, why theorists can still argue about it to no end. There's just no way to really prove it one way or another. So to contrast the first theory, a second theory could be that this relationship between consciousness and information integration is actually backwards. The suggestion here is that we have to be conscious first in order to successfully integrate certain types of information. But like the red light example, not all information is particularly complex. And there are also different levels of information processing. Like, for example, I would doubt that many people could realistically arrive at correct answers to really difficult math problems in the background processes of the mind. They really do need both attention and consciousness to solve these really complex problems. So at the end of the day here, both of these theories could essentially be correct depending on what the situational demand is. In the supplemental materials this week, this article is provided for you guys to take a look at, but I'm going to go ahead and give you some highlights from that article to help you understand that material. First, the authors are saying that when things are spatially far apart or temporally far apart, which refers to time, then consciousness is more activated because there's a lot more mental work involved. If you think about it, when things are far apart in space or in time, it takes more mental energy to think about it. So of course, this should be pretty logical. Second, semantic integration. This means when the mind is processing and correlating information from a variety of diverse sources. Again, when things are of low complexity, the mind has a much easier time integrating that information. But like we already said, when it gets more complex, we start having to become more conscious of it, because if we don't, then we fail to understand it. So to make things more complex for this discussion, that determines what is complex and what is more complex and less complex probably varies from person to person. Some people are obviously going to have an easier time with more complex information, especially if it plays to whatever their strengths are. Third, when we think about how complex information can be when we're experiencing something across multiple senses, it logically follows that we would need to be more conscious of it in order to understand that information. Again, it depends on a lot of factors, such as whether the stimulus is new, and if so, whether we're going to have to utilize more energy to understand it. Also, if the stimuli is attacking all or most of our senses at once, then it can be difficult not to be conscious of it. So think about this for a second. Think about what it would be like to be pepper sprayed. Your eyes can't see, your skin is burning, your sense of smell and taste are completely distorted. It would be difficult to be conscious of much else that is going on if that happened to you. So fourth, finally, When we are exposed to new information, we're less conscious or perhaps not really conscious at all of it, and a process gets to be more automatic and overlearned. We may not need that level of consciousness for it anymore. So if you notice, there are probably lots of things you've done so many times that you almost start doing it without thinking about it. And then you have to go back and realize that you did it and that it was so automatic for you that you failed to recall it. Again, this comes back to your mind allowing you to do things without being fully aware of it or conscious of it. So people might develop habits of like, oh my gosh, did I shut off the oven, or did I lock the door or close my garage door? And then they have to go back and double check if they actually did those things, because those processes are so automatic and overlearned that they're not really conscious of what they're doing anymore.